You are the greatest mind the world has ever known. Your feuds with the detective are the stuff of legends. You have trained others to follow in your footsteps. You are an old man. Today on the Comic Book Report, Batman Shadow War by Joshua Williamson. Stick around and check it out. Greetings from Gotham, everyone. My name is Dominic, and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I'm back in the world of Joshua Williamson's Batman with Shadow War. I had a lot of fun with this contemporary Batman crossover, and I can't wait to review it all for you today. If you're interested in picking up your own copy or looking for other collected editions, I encourage you to check out our channel sponsor, OrganicPriceBooks.com. You can use my code, TheComicBookReport, at checkout to receive $2 off of your order today. Please note, if you make any purchases using my affiliate code or link, I will earn a small commission, but it's a great way to support the channel at no additional cost to you. Thank you for considering. Now on with the review. First, some quick facts about today's collection. The issues in this volume were written by Joshua Williamson and illustrated by Howard Porter, Roger Cruz, and more. The issues in this volume were published by DC Comics beginning in 2022. The volume itself collects Shadow War Alpha number 1, Batman issues 122 and 123, Deathstroke Inc. issues 8 and 9, Robin issues 13 and 14, Shadow War Zone issue 1, and Shadow War Omega issue 1. Finally, this standard size hardcover edition comes in at 272 pages. At this time, I'd like to issue a general spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the contents of today's collection and commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. Okay, and here's our first look at that Batman Shadow War hardcover collection from DC Comics. For those that have been following the channel for a while, you might remember I did do a review for Joshua Williamson's Batman Abyss, which is kind of the preceding volume leading into this crossover. I will say at the time of recording that video, I don't even think I was aware that this existed. Someone pointed it out to me, and I'm so happy they did, so that I didn't miss some good Batman issues collected here. To my understanding, Batman Abyss and this collection, The Shadow War, rounds out the issues that Williamson did for the Batman title before it went over to Chip Zdarsky. And frankly, after enjoying Batman Abyss so much, and generally enjoying what I've read from Joshua Williamson thus far, this was more or less a no-brainer or an inevitability for me. If you notice reading Batman Abyss, there are 2 issues of Batman not collected. That is because they are part of this crossover event, so I'm really happy to round out my collection now that I have this book. And before I continue, I just want you to take a look at this gorgeous dust jacket one more time. I want you all to have the opportunity to admire this before we transition to take a look at the Under the Dust Jacket hardback artwork itself, this beautiful wraparound cover from the pages of Shadow War, beautifully represented there on the book. What a great collection. As far as the formatting goes, it is a standard size hardcover with matte paper stock, and frankly, the format itself reminds me a lot of the Joker War Saga edition. I know they also had a Fear State Saga edition. I'm a little surprised they didn't call this Batman Shadow War Saga, because it's a very similar feel, where we have the Shadow War issues of Batman, along with all of the other tie-ins that round out the event. I guess because this is more of a 3-way crossover between the Robin series, Deathstroke Inc., and Batman, that it might have been harder to call it a Batman Saga edition, but it's a very similar format, so if you've read some of those others, you will not be unfamiliar with this size. And now for all you collectors out there, I wanted to give a look at the binding. This volume is a glued binding, but it's very similar to all of these other standard size hardcovers we've been seeing for the Batman run. Nothing too new here. There is a little bit of gutter loss, which you'll see throughout the book, but nothing too crazy. Like I said, it's about standard for what we expect for these releases. No real complaints from me. As we make our way into the collection now, we start it with just the basic front matter. We have a title page, the publication information, a list of creators, before jumping into the first issue itself. And I will say right from the jump, just to give a little bit more context, this volume essentially collects a crossover between 3 series I mentioned earlier, which is Batman, Deathstroke Inc. and the Robin series. I will say this edition can absolutely stand alone. You don't really need to read anything leading into this. However, if you are up to date with some of those series I mentioned, you will obviously get a few more references as they tie into some of the things going on in those books. But again, I think this functions perfect as a standalone read should you just want to read this storyline, and I think that that's a really great feature of it. I know, for example, I reviewed Robin Volume 1 of this line that deals with the Lazarus Tournament, an event that's really touched upon in this book. Characters are mentioned, things like that, but they fill you in. You don't need to know the details, but I did review that if you're interested. But all of the series are kind of like that. You don't need to have read everything, but it does help a little bit. But again, I think this can stand alone by itself. As far as the basic synopsis of this series goes, in the beginning, basically Robin helps to inspire Ra's al Ghul and Talia to turn themselves in for all of their crimes, to kind of turn over a new leaf and be sort of the grandfather figure he's always wanted. When he goes to do this, though, he is assassinated in broad daylight in front of the public by someone who appears to be Deathstroke. This, of course, totally sets off a war between these kind of highly combative assassin-like factions between Deathstroke Incorporated and sort of the League of Shadows and things like that under Talia al Ghul, and that is, of course, this Shadow War. Everyone from those three titles are heavily impacted by this. In the world of Batman, obviously one of his nemesis, I don't know. One of his villains is obviously murdered in front of him. He's trying to figure out where Deathstroke is and try to generally de-escalate the violence and everything that will be coming after this. On the side of Robin, we have his grandfather brutally killed in front of him. He wants to find justice. And then we have Deathstroke Inc., which is maybe most fascinating of all, as we realize toward the beginning of this book that Deathstroke himself was not the one that murdered Ra's al Ghul. So we're trying to figure out who did it. And so Deathstroke really wants to clear his name before things get too out of hand. And so all of these opposing teams and things try to figure out their own ends. We have Talia just trying to unleash absolute mayhem to try to kill Deathstroke, and Batman and Robin are kind of just in the middle. And that's really the storyline for this event, the Shadow War. There are a lot of twists and turns in this event, which I'm happy to get to. And there will be a few things that obviously I'll leave for you to read yourselves. But again, a really fun little book here. I love the setup, and I think that because it's sort of a whodunit, what's happening, sort of dramatic thriller, it was a really fun kind of piece of genre writing. It was a great crossover that I think tracked really well. I will say that because there were a lot of artists in this book, there was an issue for me where I felt kind of pulled out of the comic a few times because it was very clear when we started a comic from one of the different books, it was just a dramatically different art style a few times, and I think all the styles were really great. I didn't really have a complaint with any of the artists or the styles at all. It was just that there wasn't a uniformity for this crossover event, so that can be a little jarring, where all of a sudden the same characters have completely different character models and look quite a bit different from issue to issue. But if that kind of thing doesn't bother you, the narrative itself, I think, all had a very clear voice, and that didn't waver. So there's definitely a narrative consistency throughout it. The characters felt the same throughout it. So that to me is maybe what the important thing is for the storytelling, but I would love to have seen some art styles that were maybe a little bit more consistent. And maybe that's just me, but there were a few moments that I was pulled out because of that. One plot thread of note in this volume for me, and it was one of my favorites, which was the kind of reunion between Bruce Wayne and Damian Wayne, Batman and Robin. There has been a huge kind of estrangement between these two for the better part of this last run or so, basically since the end of the Tom King run. Events that occurred in that left Damian feeling very betrayed, alone, kind of forsaken by his father. And Bruce was in a weird place where he felt like he couldn't really reach Damian. He was going through his own stuff. He felt guilty. He felt a sense of shame. There was a lot unspoken between them, and they were off kind of doing their own things. We know, if we've read the pages of Robin, that Damian's trying to find himself, become his own champion, figuring who he is outside of Batman. And Batman's caught up in all of his own hijinks, as we saw in the Tiny and Batman era and the Detective Comics era of that time. And so this is one of the big reunions I had been waiting for as a Batman fan. I'm a huge fan of Damian Wayne Robin, and I was eagerly awaiting seeing these two coming back together. And so I was really delighted to see that depicted in the pages of Shadow War. It definitely is a really interesting reunion. We have Damian trying to save the body of Ra's al Ghul Ghul after he's shot in the head, presumably to put it in a Lazarus pit and bring him back. But Deathstroke, or the person appearing to be Deathstroke, throws a grenade. Damian thinks he can get him in time. Batman disagrees, grabs his son, and dives out of the way as the grenade goes off, completely vaporizing Raz's body. This leads to a moment of just absolute tragedy for Damian, who feels like his father stood in the way of, him kind of resurrecting his grandfather, but at the same time, he feels that paternal, just kind of nurturing and saving and just that protective nature of him. But there's definitely a dynamic between them. Batman then says some really screwed up stuff, and I won't spoil that for you for those that haven't read the Tom King run, but he says something that kind of sows more division between the two of them, but they kind of ally themselves to find Deathstroke and try to bring about an de-escalation to this situation. Although not quite at first, Robin does his own thing. He teams up with Ravager for a minute, but they eventually kind of make amends for the most part. We get to see some really cool Batman and Robin dynamics by the end of Shadow War, and I love seeing that. I also love seeing Batman, Robin, and Talia al Ghul sharing some scenes. There was definitely kind of a brief romantic connection between Batman and Talia al Ghul, and I was kind of shaken by that because I'm firmly in the Batman Catwoman train, and he even says like, oh wait, but Selina, like when he kisses her, and it was just kind of this weird moment, and the moment passed and it was what it was, but it was just a really interesting dynamic. Anytime you have Talia al Ghul and Batman together, it's definitely a compelling read. I think Damian Wayne just further makes those issues complex in their own way. Some of the other kind of issues like Deathstroke Inc. I had not read anything about. I don't know a ton about Deathstroke other than his origins and when he shows up as like a Batman villain. So I haven't been keeping up on his solo titles at all, but I felt like the issues we got were a ton of fun. At this point, he's trying to kind of disciple his sort of son, Respawn, who we know from the Lazarus tournament. Very, very cool dynamic, this father-son dynamic for most of the book. We also have Ravager showing up, his daughter, in a couple issues throughout, so there's a lot of good Deathstroke family dynamics, and it's interesting to see how he's sort of trying to clear his own name, but he gets caught up in sort of the cycle of violence, and so by the end, it doesn't even matter if he's the one that killed or not. He's full on the warpath against Talia al Ghul, and everything really just comes to a head with all of these different factions. In the midst of all of this, we also have the Batman Incorporated team show up and sort of help Batman's interests. This team's led by Ghostmaker, we have Clown Hunter, and a couple of the other characters we know from the Batman Inc. universe. Those two characters are, of course, from James Tynion's run on Batman, that being Ghostmaker and Clown Hunter. So if you want to know more about those characters, you can check out some of my reviews from Tynion's run. But overall, a very cool set of Batman universe characters, and it was really refreshing to have Bruce Wayne Batman and Damian Wayne Robin back together. I was surprised that we didn't get any kind of Nightwing in this book, much at all, very little Oracle, but it was still a really fun time with a lot of these different characters. Another notable addition to this series was Black Canary. She showed up maybe midway and toward the end of the volume, and her inclusion was really fun. She has a history with one of the assassins in Talia al Ghul's sort of elite team that she sends after Deathstroke, so we have some cool confrontations there, and overall, this was just a fun DC Universe crossover, and again, this does feel more like a crossover DC book rather than explicitly a Batman book. Of course, it is more Batman than anything else, I would say, but I get why it wasn't just labeled a Batman saga, but rather Batman Shadow War. Really a great title. I really like that I didn't have to keep up with some of the other titles to appreciate this by itself. I think that that's an absolute plus whenever I read a crossover or event, because I think it's more accessible as an on-ramp to prospective readers out there, that you don't have to be absolutely entrenched in the continuity of all of these different series to effectively enjoy one single story arc. And I think that that's something that Shadow War pulls off really well, and it was a delight to read. I do think that the singular narrative voice was again very much felt throughout all of the different issues, even as the artistic style shifted quite a bit from series to series, and I think that that's largely thanks to Joshua Williamson, of course the writer of the series is, and I really liked that. I really enjoyed his work on Batman Abyss, so I was eager to round out his work on Batman by checking out this title, and now that I've read it, I am happy I did. I don't think that overall this is the most classic Batman epic as far as I'm concerned, but it was still an above average read that I enjoyed immensely from cover to cover. I am absolutely eager to jump on the Zdarsky Batman train now that I've finished Williamson and Tynion's era, and I'm really excited for what comes next. But this was a really fun facet of his Batman work. Interestingly enough, I mentioned it earlier, I believe, that Batman Abyss had 2 missing Batman issues that are included here. So Williamson's run kind of has the Abyss storyline, then the Shadow War, then kind of the epilogue Abyss issue, which was included back during that volume. So it is really interesting if you want to read Williamson's Batman era, because I think you basically just need Abyss and this Shadow War. But it was just collected in kind of a weird way, I thought, but I do enjoy it, and I'm happy to finally have read those Batman issues. I see why they weren't included with Abyss, as they're very much kind of load-bearing crossover issues for Shadow War. I think one mistake I may have made expectation-wise coming into Shadow War was assuming I'd see more about Ra's al Ghul throughout the volume. We do see him in the beginning, obviously, and then maybe in 1 or 2 flashbacks, but for the most part, he's dead and gone, and so most of this is revolving around Deathstroke, Talia al Ghul, Batman, Damian Wayne Robin, and all of the assassins or kind of assistants characters on both factions. And you know what? It has enough characters. It does a great job. We don't need to have Ra's al Ghul, but I think I expected to see a little bit more from him, and I'm not really sure why. But again, his absence isn't missed, just something to note as far as my expectation level. If you're expecting to read a Ra's al Ghul story, this is not it. This is a story about something that happens to him, and then ultimately this is mostly about the fallout afterward. And so I think that that's just something to note. This volume also ends right before the Dark Crisis event, and it even says kind of like, follow up with these events in Dark Crisis. I have no idea how this leads into Dark Crisis. I have not read DC's Dark Crisis. If you know how this ties in or how this leads into that, I'd be very curious to hear in the comments below. Or if generally Dark Crisis is something worth picking up in the future. But like I said, I think that this is very much a standalone volume and can be enjoyed as such. Switching over to the artistic side of this book, like I said, we have a vast array of artistic designs and creators on this book, as there are so many different titles collected across those 3 series, plus some of the one-shots having to do with Shadow War. And I think all the art styles were absolutely fair, and I do like, for the most part, that we have a variety of artists. There is a bit of a sampling of this and that, so that everyone's probably going to find at least something they enjoy artistically in this book. But I just think that the art styles were so different that, again, sometimes it took me out of the reading experience when I jumped issue to issue and had a drastically different feel for the art, especially when, again, that narrative direction and voice from Williamson was so consistent throughout the title. Something to note as well, I know especially the Robin issues feel a bit more cartoony as far as the art style. I do like the artist, I think it's very striking, but for those that prefer more of a realistic approach to the character models, there is more cartoony art styles throughout this book, so that's just something to be aware of. I think it was still done really well. The action sequences are incredible. I think some of the general settings and detail work are all really well done. I don't think that there's any severely lacking art in this book. A couple things to note as well. There's an issue that flashbacks to Talia al Ghul's sort of history and upbringing, and that artist has a really dreamlike, almost surreal quality to his or her artwork, and I thought that that was absolutely breathtaking, to the point where I'd love to see that artist depict like fairy tales or something. It's just a really striking issue. We get to see Talia trying to find out more about her family's history in the Lazarus pits, and the issue itself for me was narratively okay, but the art I just found absolutely breathtaking. Would love to see more from that artist. We also have an issue that deals with Batman and Robin sort of interrogating a prisoner, kind of saying they're their lawyers, so that the person comes into this room. And the art in that is almost more hyper-realistic and more detailed. And I think that those issues were, for me, some that stood out just artistically. Really liked seeing that. I think the Batman issues also had just really striking art. Deathstroke wasn't overly impressed with. Robin, same. But again, just really great artists throughout, and everyone has different taste. I don't think that there was poor art in this entire collection, but would have liked to see maybe a bit more consistency, just for me personally as a reader. At the end of the collection, we have some great extras, a ton of variant cover art and art gallery stuff, and that really rounds out the collection for Batman Shadow War. There's so much more to talk about with this collection, but I'll leave that up to you and your own reading to enjoy. Beyond that, I just wanted to give you a look at the other Williamson book, Batman Abyss. Check out that review on my channel again if you're interested. And that's Batman Shadow War. And now let's go ahead and get to that grade. For an absolutely well-paced and entertaining ride from cover to cover, the Comic Book Report is happy to give Batman Shadow War by Joshua Williamson a B. For all intents and purposes, I find this to be an absolute blast as a standalone read, a fun blending of a couple contemporary titles within the DC universe that I think really worked well together in a way that seemed, well, truly seamless. Other than some jarring art transitions between series, but I think again, this was a fun read. I love some of the characters we got to focus on, particularly the reunion between Batman and Robin, and just seeing the warring factions between Talia al Ghul and Deathstroke and company. This definitely deserves an above average score for me, and I think that this was one I would absolutely revisit sometime in the future. I will say if some of these series don't strike an interest for you, I wouldn't consider this a must-read Batman book, but it's certainly one that I found to be more entertaining than it could have been, and as a newer Williamson fan, it was one I was happy to check out. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching the Comic Book Report. Don't forget to leave your like, and have a good one.